Hey, in this video, we'll talk about hormones that are pretty relevant to exercise. We'll focus on what we call catecholamines, epinephrine, norepinephrine, and we'll also talk about hormones that control blood glucose and fat mobilization. So first, we'll talk sympathetic, parasympathetic. We'll talk about glycogen and glucose utilization, a lot about insulin and glucagon, a lot about norepinephrine, epinephrine in this video. So as we go through these things, I want you guys to keep a running list of some of the following things. First, epinephrine, norepinephrine, these are very powerful hormones that have effects all throughout the body. We're going to keep hearing about them as we go through the rest of our year. They have effects on the pancreas, they have effects on blood vessel, heart, the airways, and so start a running list of what these things do, epinephrine, norepinephrine, because you'll need to understand that as we get toward the end of the semester. Now, the endocrine system is kind of similar to the nervous system in that it helps communicate between cells. The nervous system tends to be much more targeted, where you send a specific signal to a specific cell or a specific region. Like the nervous system can make a muscle contract in one area and not in another. The endocrine system sends messages, but it's a global, a systemic signal by releasing what we call hormones or molecules into the blood that then circulate throughout the body. And anything that has a receptor for that hormone will then respond. So things like epinephrine will go into the blood, and if that blood hits up the heart, it will increase heart rate and contractility, or how hard the heart contracts. If that same epinephrine makes its way to the pancreas, it will affect the activity of the pancreas, as we'll see in a minute. And so it can have a myriad of effects, a hormone can. And the effect depends on not only on what the hormone is, but also what cell is receiving the signal and what receptor on the cell receives the signal. So the sympathetic parasympathetic system, we're starting with the nervous system because it is highly related to the endocrine function as well. You could kind of consider the parasympathetic, sympathetic especially to be both nervous system and endocrine. So we've talked through earlier in the semester about how you have sympathetic nerves that will be triggered and increase heart rate, and they release epinephrine, norepinephrine. Primarily norepinephrine is released from the nerves, about 80% roughly of the what's released from the sympathetic is norepinephrine, and then about 20% is epinephrine. Those are rough averages. And that'll trigger the cells right next to the nerve endings. But the nervous system, sympathetic nervous system, also directly will innervate the adrenal gland. And on that adrenal gland, when it's stimulated by epinephrine, norepinephrine, it will then release epinephrine, norepinephrine into the blood. So you have the nervous system stimulating the gland, which then releases the hormone. Okay, so you can see how the sympathetic system kind of has dual citizenship, being in the nervous system and in the endocrine system. Now, as I mentioned, the effect of a hormone depends on not only what the hormone is, but what cells receiving that signal and what receptor binds it. So if the hormone is a key, the keyhole, what receives the hormone, also influences how the cell will respond. And a great example of that comes with epinephrine, norepinephrine. So epinephrine can be released into the blood, and it can bind to all sorts of these receptors. We call them adrenergic, like adrenal, adrenergic. You have beta 1, beta 2, beta 3, alpha 1, and alpha 2 receptors. And if epinephrine binds onto a beta 2 receptor, it generally will, on an artery, it will generally cause vasodilation. It initiates a different pathway. If that same epinephrine binds on to an alpha-1 receptor on the artery, it will cause vasoconstriction. Two differing responses, so exact opposite. One causes the artery to get bigger, one causes the artery to get smaller, and it's the same hormone. So it depends on what's receiving the signal. Just like if you are a door-to-door salesman and you go to one door and you try and sell them your solar power or whatever, pest control, they might be totally into it. And then you give the same spiel at the next door and they don't want it at all, right? You gave the same message, same hormone, but because the receptor is different, you get a different outcome. Now, the parasympathetic and sympathetic systems respond to exercise. As you, sorry, my computer's being a little funny. As you exercise, you know you have an increase in heart rate, right? Now that increase in heart rate comes because of both parasympathetic and sympathetic activity. The parasympathetic nervous system is often, you think about it, rest and digest. So it's actually slowing down your heart rate. And the sympathetic system will speed it up. So when you first exercise, what we see is actually a removal of the parasympathetic system, and that causes the immediate increase in heart rate. And then slowly the sympathetic system will increase heart rate. Let me explain it in another way. So right now you probably are thinking my average heart rate is about 70 beats per minute. If we took out all the nerves from your heart, just cut them off, the heart can still beat. It has its own rhythmicity, can cause its own action potentials, and it will generally go at about 100 beats per minute without any kind of innervation. So with no interference from the nervous system or from any hormones, the heart will go at about 100 beats per minute. But you're going at 60 to 70 right now, and the reason for that is because the parasympathetic system is sending an inhibitory signal or hyperpolarizing the membrane potential of the heart and slowing down heart rate. So when you want to increase heart rate with exercise, the first thing you do is take your foot off of the brake or take your foot off of the parasympathetic system, disinhibition of the heart rate, and then you will increase heart rate with the sympathetic system. And how much sympathetic activity is going on depends on the intensity of the exercise. This is really important for exercise physiology. If you're at a lower intensity of exercise, something that's generally pretty easy for you, so right here, about 40 to 50% of your VO2 max, you'll have a little increase in sympathetic activity. We'll see some epinephrine and norepinephrine in the blood, but not a whole lot. But as we go up to things that are more challenging, VO2 max or above VO2 max, you start to see more epinephrine in the blood. Sympathetic activity is strongly related to how hard something is for you. If let's say that you and I are running side by side and you're in great shape and I'm in terrible shape, we're going the same speed. Let's say we're both running 5 miles per hour. For me, it's really, really hard. So my sympathetic system is going to be off the charts. But for you, since you're in super good shape, it's only a low percentage of your VO2 max, your sympathetic system might not be going all that much. And so that's going to dictate the physiological responses that we'll see later with fat mobilization, glycogenolysis, inhibition of insulin. So a person that has the exercise is very difficult for them, it'll be a high sympathetic response and everything will be going crazy throughout the body. A person that is in good shape, it's a low sympathetic response and it won't be that difficult. We won't see as many things changing due to the sympathetic activity because it's just not there. So here's another example that training, it reduces the sympathetic response to exercise. So in this study, as a summary of a classic study, they endurance trained people for several weeks and had them do the same exercise. So let's say it was running that 5 miles per hour. You take someone out of shape and have them run 5 miles per hour, and it causes a big sympathetic response. We see a lot of epinephrine, norepinephrine in the blood, and a lot of norepinephrine being released from sympathetic nerves. Then as we have them endurance train over time, week by week, it gets easier for them and we see less norepinephrine and epinephrine in the blood. So there'll be less stimulus to the heart rate. Epinephrine, norepinephrine have a potent effect on blood pressure. So you could imagine that we would see less of a blood pressure response there over time. And you'll see less of an effect of epinephrine and norepinephrine on our metabolic hormones like insulin, glucagon, glycogenolysis, all these other things. So we're going to see what the sympathetic system does now to insulin and glucagon. And we'll go into more detail with this later, but sympathetic system is all about fight or flight. A parasympathetic system is rest and digest. Insulin is more of a rest and digest thing. We use insulin for storing glucose, for signaling for the storage of fat. We use glucagon for signaling energy mobilization. Glucagon is going to make more glucose available by glycogenolysis. It's going to make more fatty acids available. So when you're exercising, you have a sympathetic signal, and you want energy available. So epinephrine, norepinephrine is going to increase glucagon secretion, and it actually inhibits insulin secretion. So now let's talk about how we get glycogen to be utilized and what signals for glucose transport. So as we've talked about in the past, you store glucose in your muscle and in your liver in the form of glycogen. So you ate your spaghetti dinner, you took the glucose into the cell, and then you processed it and stored it as glycogen right there in the cell. When you exercise, you want to make use of that glycogen. And so we have this enzyme right here that converts glycogen back down to glucose 6-phosphate. This is called phosphorylase. And this enzyme is sensitive to epinephrine. So we have a sympathetic response to exercise. Epinephrine, norepinephrine is released. It binds onto the receptor on the cell, which will then stimulate something called cyclic AMP, which then stimulates phosphorylase. So another way we could say this is epinephrine binds onto the receptor and causes phosphorylase to break down glycogen, and that will make our glycogen more available, or glucose 6-phosphate available for glycolysis. Another way of stimulating, this is a beautiful design, is with calcium. This enzyme phosphorylase is also sensitive to the level of calcium in the cell. So in a muscle cell, we want to contract, release calcium from the SR, right? So we're going to have calcium come out, and we think about that binding to troponin and helping with the muscle contraction. That same calcium is also serving as a signal to phosphorylase to start breaking down glycogen and making it available for use. So the same signal that causes the muscle contraction is also making energy more available to fuel the muscle contraction. It's wonderful, really cool setup. My compliments to the designer. Now, what about using glycogen during exercise? We only have a certain amount of glycogen that we can store in our muscles. Certain things can increase that storage, like a high carbohydrate diet. Certain things like a low carb diet can decrease that storage. But what determines how quickly we run out of that glycogen? It's going to depend on what your fuel is for the exercise, which is highly related to the intensity of the exercise, and it's going to depend on the duration. So let's look at this. During exercise, about 30 or 60% of your VO2 max, we see glycogen levels decrease in muscle cells and throughout the body, but not all that much. We go for 2 hours, and at 30% of VO2 max, we see just a little bit of glycogen depletion. If we're at 60% of VO2 max, we see about 40% reduction. And the reason for this is because at these lower intensities, we're using mostly fat for our fuels. We still use some carbs, but at lower intensities, we're going to use fat for our fuel. Now, at high intensities, like 90% of VO2 max or 120% of VO2 max, we use a lot of carbohydrates, especially at 90% of VO2 max. But we don't deplete because at 90% of VO2 max, we're going to have peripheral fatigue accrue Things like acids and phosphates are going to accrue and cause peripheral fatigue in the muscle and make us stop exercising before we actually have a chance to deplete all of our glycogen. If there was some way that you could prevent peripheral fatigue from happening, you're definitely on track to deplete your glycogen, but the muscle just gets fatigued too quickly. So in an exercise at about 90% VO2 max, something that you can hold for about 30 minutes, you're probably not going to deplete your glycogen. So really the area that we got to worry about glycogen depletion is what we call the heavy intensity domain, between lactate threshold and critical power, this exercise that you can do for a decent amount of time that's mostly carbohydrate fueled. And in those conditions, in the heavy domain, about 75% of VO2 max, you'll see you're at high risk of glycogen depletion. So for exercises like 30% or 60% of VO2 max, or 90 to 120%, so 90% of VO2 max would be like a 5K to a mile run, you don't really have to worry about running out of glycogen or supplementing carbohydrates, because other things are going to cause you to fail before that becomes an issue. And in exercises that are utilizing fat, it's going to be really hard to run out of glycogen. It's possible, like imagine if this 60% VO2 max exercise went on for several more hours, then you would start to run out of glycogen, but that's going to take a long time. So the magic area where we worry about supplementing carbohydrates and running out of glycogen is going to be in the heavy intensity domain at about 75% of VO2 max. And so just as a rule of thumb, if you're exercising and you're going over 30 to 40 minutes, it's probably a good idea to start bringing in glucose with like a Gatorade or Skittles or whatever you want. It just has to be sugar, and that will help offset some of this glycogen depletion. But if it's an exercise that's shorter than 30 minutes, chances are you're not going to run out of glycogen, so you don't need to worry about supplementing. So now let's talk about how we actually get the glucose into the cell in the first place. Now, you guys have learned about insulin and glucagon in the past. There's a lot of misconceptions about insulin. Insulin, for example, it does not take glucose into the cell. It's a hormone. It signals to cells to bring glucose in. Glucagon is also a hormone that signals to cells to release insulin, or sorry, not release insulin, release glucose. So in this little teeter-totter diagram that I use, if the signals for insulin went out, like high glucose or parasympathetic activity, you'll get the following consequences. Increased uptake of glucose into the cell, increased uptake of fatty acids into adipocytes, and you also get vasodilation. So, things that will cause insulin secretion, high blood glucose, parasympathetic activity. Exercise actually will inhibit it. So, sympathetic activity, like you see during exercise, will be a signal that pushes up on the teeter-totter and make it so that you don't have as much insulin being released. Now, people often have an issue with this. Why are you inhibiting the release of insulin during exercise? Don't you want more glucose into the cell? The answer is yes. You do want more glucose, but you don't want more glucose to go into every cell. You just want it in a few cells. From now on, when you think of insulin, don't just think of glucose uptake. I want you to think of glucose and fatty acid storage. Insulin is great for storing stuff. And when you are exercising, you don't want glucose to be stored in cells that aren't active. You want glucose to go to cells that need it in that moment. And that's what glucagon is going to do. If glucagon signal wins out and you have more glucagon than insulin, you will get increased release of glucose into the blood from glycogenolysis. You'll get release of free fatty acids from lipolysis. And so things that will signal glucagon release from the pancreas are going to be low blood glucose. So if you're fasting and you haven't eaten for a while, that will increase the signal for glucagon release to hopefully cause more glucose to go into the blood and get you back to a normal level. Sympathetic activity, like you see during exercise, also increases the release of glucagon. And so now let's think about sympathetic activity during exercise. It inhibits insulin and it stimulates glucagon. So now we'll see this teeter-totter tip over to increase release of blood glucose into the blood, or increase release of glucose into the blood and also fatty acids. Other things that we'll see during that will influence glucagon release from the pancreas is insulin. Insulin would push up on this teeter-totter and decrease the release of glucagon. So insulin is very much a rest and digest and storage hormone. Glucagon, on the other hand, is much more of a energy mobilization. It's going to get the carbohydrates and fats out there to be utilized. So now let's look at how we get glucose into the cell then. So we often think about insulin for glucose uptake. And as I mentioned, insulin does not take glucose into the cell. It's a hormone that signals to the cell to bring glucose in. So glucose is actually transported into the cell by glucose transporters. In the skeletal muscle, we have glucose transporter 4 or glucose translocase 4 that during resting conditions, it's going to be just dormant inside of the cell, but then it gets a signal from insulin receptor to mobilize to the muscle cell membrane. So it'll go from the inside and then make its way to the cell membrane, and then that allows the glucose to come in. Look, the insulin does not touch the glucose. What the insulin is doing is it binds onto its receptor, an insulin receptor on the skeletal muscle membrane, that then initiates a whole series of events. There's like 10 different things that happen here in this arrow. That one thing, the insulin receptor stimulates this, which stimulates that, which makes this happen, which makes that happen, which eventually causes GLUT4 to go and be translocated. If you're looking at type 1 diabetes, or type 2 diabetes, it is a problem in this here. Initially, type 2 diabetics have insulin, but they are unable to get the signaling between the insulin receptor and GLUT4 to work properly. Type 1 diabetes would be an issue with not having the insulin. So now let's look at this. What happens to insulin secretion during exercise? First off, when you exercise, you want more glucose, right? You want to go through glycolysis to provide energy for the cell. But as you go to higher intensities of exercise, going from rest to higher exercise, you see less insulin. Right? It's going to go down. So you might think this is a dumb idea. Why would we decrease insulin secretion when we want more glucose in the cell? As I mentioned, you want glucose in the right cells. Insulin is a hormone. It's going to all of your cells. And you don't have a whole lot of glucose in your blood. If you actually do the calculations, the body maintains your blood glucose levels very tightly if it works well, and you don't hold a lot of glucose in there. It's about as much as is in those sugar packets that you see at restaurants. It's not a whole lot of glucose floating around in the blood. And so because of that, we have to be very deliberate about where we send the glucose. If I'm doing leg exercise, I want that glucose to go to my legs, not to my arms. And if I increase insulin secretion, yes, I would send insulin to the muscle, which would help glucose go into the leg muscles, but I would also send insulin to the arms and skin and other places, which would make glucose go other places it's not needed. So in order to be more precise about where we get glucose uptake, we actually inhibit insulin secretion during exercise. And then we work on getting glucose in another way. It's a really cool design. So remember, insulin is not what takes glucose in. It's a signal. GLUT4 is what's taking glucose into the muscle cells. And we have other things that will stimulate GLUT4 to go to the cell membranes. So the breakdown of ATP to AD and ADP into the third product called ANP, right? ATP has 3 phosphates, adenosine triphosphate. ADP has 2 phosphates, adenosine diphosphate. If we break that down even further, we get down to adenosine monophosphate. And that AMP is a powerful signal that through a bunch of different enzymes and chain of events will then cause GLUT4 to go to the cell membrane and bring glucose in. I think this is a great signal. Think about it. We want glucose in the cell in the first place to help restore our ATP levels. And what better signal to bring glucose in then than a signal of low ATP? If you have AMP, adenosine monophosphate, that means you've broken down a lot of your ATP and you need glucose to help increase more. So you see this AMP during exercise, especially intense exercise. Another signal for GLUT4 translocation is that same calcium release we talked about earlier. Remember, calcium being released from the SR to bind onto troponin. That same calcium is going to signal through a series of events to GLUT4 to bring glucose into the cell. So I just think it's a great, simple, direct design. The same thing that's signaling for the muscles to use energy, calcium, is signaling to bring glucose in to help provide more energy. So during exercise, we have less insulin floating around, and so that we stop taking up glucose into unnecessary cells, or we don't stop it, we reduce how much is being taken into unnecessary cells. And then we rely more on these other signals, AMP and calcium, to stimulate GLUT4. These are going to be highly specific signals that are going to be mostly in your active skeletal muscle. So we turn off the universal or systemic signal to bring glucose into everything with insulin, and we turn on the signals just to bring glucose into the active cells that need it the most. We're kind of budgeting where we put our glucose. Now, let's talk again about type 1 versus type 2 diabetes. I mentioned this a little bit, but type 1 diabetes is usually an issue that a person's pancreas does not make sufficient or does not make any insulin. And so if we have no insulin signal, especially at rest, we're not going to be able to get glucose to come into the cell. So people with type 1 diabetes at rest, they have a hard time getting glucose stored. So what could you potentially do to bring glucose into the cell for a person with type 1 diabetes? You could have them exercise. If they have high blood glucose levels, get them to start moving around, get that AMP is the main signal. Or get the calcium release in the skeletal muscle, and then that will signal for GLUT4 to bring glucose in. It's definitely a way to help bring the glucose under control, but you can't be exercising all the time. Insulin definitely has a very important role in maintaining health. And so, as you should have seen in the readings before this, and in some of the videos I have you watch, people with type 1 diabetes, it's a serious issue, especially 100 years ago. It was a fatal condition. Children that were diagnosed with type 1 diabetes did not live more than a year after diagnosis because they just could not get the energy into their cells. Now, fortunately, with research and hardworking scientists and students like you have dedicated their lives, and research subjects and animals that have dedicated their lives to figuring this out, we now know what insulin does, and we've developed ways of delivering insulin to people whose pancreas doesn't make it. It used to be injections, and now more and more people with type 1 diabetes walk around with an insulin pump that will just deliver insulin into the body, almost like an external pancreas. Initial pumps, insulin pumps, were blind. They didn't know what your blood glucose was. They just trickled the insulin into your body. And now let's imagine that you have a person that you're having exercise that has one of these insulin pumps. Now, let's say they keep the pump going while they're exercising. That means that they have insulin being secreted into the blood and demanding blood glucose uptake from all the cells, and they have the active cells demanding blood glucose uptake. So if they keep the pump going while they're exercising, they're at a very high risk of going hypoglycemic. So individuals who use insulin injections or these earlier generation pumps that don't know your blood glucose levels, They often will have to turn off the pump when they exercise, just like we do with our nervous systems. If you have a functional pancreas, we turn off the insulin secretion from our pancreas so that we don't go hypoglycemic, so that we prioritize where the blood glucose goes. They'll turn off the pump and just allow these mechanisms to control blood glucose levels. If they have insulin secretion high and the blood glucose and the skeletal muscle uptake high, there's a very real chance that they'll go hypoglycemic, and that creates a lot of problems. So if you're thinking about going into exercise physiology or personal training, this is something really good to know for individuals with diabetes. So type 1 diabetes, you lose that signal there. In type 2 diabetes, as I mentioned, you have a problem with this signaling here, usually between the insulin receptor and GLUT4. And there's lots of steps there. And people dedicate their lives to figuring out all of these steps. And I've simplified it with one arrow, which is kind of sad. But in type 2 diabetes, this signaling can be slowed or dysfunctional. So initially with insulin resistance, what that means is they secrete insulin, but they can't get enough of the signaling to go to GLUT4. So the initial response would be to compensate and secrete more insulin so that they get at least some of the signaling going through. So insulin resistance means you require more insulin than normal to get the same level of blood glucose control. I apologize for the background noise. I've got some kind of construction going on outside my house. All right, so that's all I want to talk about for today. In this video, there should be another video that you'll watch about fat mobilization and how insulin is used for fat storage, and how glucagon is used for fat mobilization and glucose mobilization.